Her father spent 2 years mapping these mountains. She spent 8 months running them. Nobody cared. She was just the courier, standard issue, fine for what she does. Then 200 soldiers had their positions compromised, communications jammed, helicopters grounded, one trail through the Andes that nobody knew about, except her. She ran it in the dark, alone, 40 kilometers, no backup. And at kilometer 34, she opened her father's map. The ledge he had drawn 30 years ago was gone, buried under a landslide. The mountain had changed. She was standing in the dark with an enemy post above her and a map that couldn't help her anymore. Everything she had was what she had found herself. On the runs, nobody watched her run. This is the story of Specialist Bryn Hartley, and the trail her father didn't finish mapping. Bryn Hartley ran the mountain route every Tuesday and Thursday before the base woke up. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it was in her job description. She ran it because the route was there, and because she was the one who had to carry classified materials along it, and because she had decided early in her assignment at FOB Kandahar that if she was going to do a job, she was going to know the job completely. This meant knowing the terrain the way a mechanic knows an engine, the way a pilot knows an airspace. Not from a map, from her feet. She ran it in the dark, she ran it in rain, she ran it in the cold that came off the Andean peaks at this elevation with a specific searching quality, the kind of cold that found the spaces between your clothing and settled there. She was 5'2" and 118 pounds. And she had been running mountain trails since she was 7 years old, which meant she had been running them for 17 years, which meant she was better at it than most people would ever know, because most people never watched the courier do her work. FOB Kandahar sat at 2,800 meters above sea level in the Colombian Andes, on a rocky plateau that the locals used for cattle grazing in better seasons and that the U.S. Army used for advisory operations in this one. The base was small, roughly 200 personnel, a special forces element, a Colombian military liaison contingent, a signals unit, an intelligence section, which was where Bryn worked as a 35F intelligence analyst, and also the primary classified materials courier for the S2 section. The materials she carried were sensitive. The routes she carried them on were mountain trails ranging from 12 to 30 kilometers. Nobody had given her these routes because they thought she was particularly suited for them. She had been given them because she was small and light and unlikely to be mistaken from a distance for a soldier carrying anything of consequence. She was, in the operational calculus of the men who assigned her the role, the kind of person who did not attract attention. They were not entirely wrong about that. They were deeply wrong about why. She had been at FOB Kandahar for 8 months. In that time, she had covered over 2,000 kilometers of mountain trail on foot. She had cataloged 11 route variations that did not appear on current operational maps. She had noted water sources, choke points, elevation changes, seasonal trail conditions, and the places where a person moving quietly could disappear from sight in under 30 seconds. She had written all of this in a small green notebook she kept in her left cargo pocket. The notebook was new. What she carried in her chest pocket, next to her heart, was old. Her father's journal was a worn, spiral-bound survey notebook from 1987, its cover water-damaged and its pages dense with handwritten notes in the small, precise script of Thomas Hartley, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Survey Team Delta Andean Infrastructure Assessment 1986-1988. Her father had spent 2 years in these mountains, mapping terrain for joint U.S.-Colombian military infrastructure planning that had never fully materialized. He had come home with 3 notebooks full of observations, 2 commendations, and a cartographic instinct that he spent the rest of his life applying to civilian trail mapping in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. He had died when Bryn was 17. Heart attack, sudden, at 53 years old, on a trail he had mapped himself and walked 100 times. She had found the body. She had sat with him for a long time before she went back down to get help. She had not been able to explain this to anyone afterward in a way that made complete sense. She had simply not been ready to leave him on his trail. She had taken his survey journal from his desk the week after the funeral, the one labeled Clocampabia. She had not known then that she would enlist. She had not known she would end up here. She had not known the mountains her father had mapped would become the mountains she carried classified materials through twice a week before the base woke up. Some things are not known in advance. They are recognized when you arrive. But here was the thing about her father's maps that she had learned in the White Mountains. From years of following his notebooks into terrain, he had charted 30 years before she was born. The maps were always right about the mountain as it had been. The mountain as it was right now, on this day, in this season, after this decade of erosion and freeze and thaw and storm, was something the map could only approximate. Her father had understood this. He had always said, the notebook is a starting point, not the destination. The mountain will tell you what it is when you get there. Use the notebook to get close. Use your eyes for the rest. She had been using her eyes for the rest her entire life. Captain Joel Strand commanded the operational element at FOB Condor. He was 37 years old, from Colorado, with the economical, focused manner of a man who has been in special operations, long enough that everything he does has been optimized down to its functional core. He was not unkind. He was efficient. And efficiency in his world meant knowing what a resource was, knowing what it was for, and deploying it accordingly. Bryn was a resource he knew how to label. Intelligence, courier function, document handling, not an operational asset. He had said this, more or less exactly, 3 weeks into her assignment at FOB Condor, when she had requested to join a patrol familiarization exercise that his element was conducting on the northern approaches. He had said, courier personnel don't need to know patrol routes, they need to know delivery routes. Those are different. She had said, with respect, Captain, the delivery routes intersect with the patrol routes at several points. Understanding the patrol pattern would help me avoid crossing into operational areas during courier runs. He had said, we'll deconflict that through the S3. It's not a security concern about you. It's just not the right use of a courier slot in a patrol FTX. She had said, I understand. She had gone back to her desk. She had added the patrol route intersection points to her green notebook from memory, because she had studied the patrol maps before making the request. Because that was the kind of thing she always did before a conversation that mattered. That was the first specific incident. There were others. The second happened a month later. She had submitted a formal terrain assessment through the S2 section, flagging a trail variation she had discovered on the northeast approach that provided an alternate route to Waypoint Kestrel that reduced travel time by approximately 40 minutes and avoided 2 points of elevated enemy observation. She submitted it as a routine addendum to her courier log, properly formatted, with coordinates and elevation notes. Captain Strand received it, logged it in the system, and did nothing with it, not because he was negligent. Because it was a courier's terrain note, and in his model of operations, couriers observed and reported, and operators acted on their reports, and the timing of that process was an operational decision, not an administrative one. The 40-minute route variation sat in the system log. Nobody used it. The third incident was the one she heard directly. She was in the supply corridor outside the S3 planning room, carrying a document package, when she heard Strand's voice through the half-open door. He was briefing his element on the next operational cycle. She was not the subject of the briefing. She became the subject of a single sentence at the end. He said, and the courier section will run standard document transfers on Tuesday and Thursday as scheduled. They don't need to know anything else about the operational timeline. One of his sergeants said, the courier, the small one, what's her background? Strand said, S2 analyst, courier certified, standard issue. She's fine for what she does, standard issue. She is fine for what she does. She stood in the corridor with the document package and let those words find where they were going to land inside her. Then she walked the rest of the way to the S2 section, logged the package transfer, and went back to her desk. She opened her green notebook. She wrote down the date. She wrote down, standard issue. She drew a line under it. She went back to work. She was not angry. She had learned to convert anger into observation a long time ago in the White Mountains, running trails that her father had marked and the local boys had told her were too hard for a girl her size. She had learned that the fastest way to prove someone wrong was to go farther and come back less tired than they expected. The mountain did not care what you expected. The mountain only cared whether you had prepared. She had prepared. She kept running the route on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She kept cataloging the terrain. She kept carrying the journal. On one of those Thursday mornings, approximately 3 months into her assignment, she found the trail. She had been pushing the northeast approach further than she usually went, past the waypoint where her standard route turned back, following a feature she had noticed on a satellite imagery overlay, a depression in the ridgeline that suggested a pass of some kind. The terrain was rough. It took her 40 minutes to climb from the valley floor to the ridge. At the top, she stopped and looked south. She could see the route immediately. The way it descended the far side of the ridge in a series of natural terraces, following the contour of the rock, navigable for someone who knew how to read the terrain. She pulled the journal from her chest pocket. She opened it to the Columbia section. She found the entry dated November 1987, Northeastern Sector, Survey Day 47. Her father's handwriting, small and precise. Ridge crossing at 4,100 meet confirmed viable. Descends via natural terracing to valley floor, approximately 40 kilometers to secondary waypoint by this route. Trail shows no recent use. Rocky but stable. Estimated solo transit time 10-12 hours for determined traveler. Recommend for emergency alternate route consideration. She read it twice. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the valley below. She took out her green notebook and wrote down the coordinates. She photographed the terrain feature with her phone. She wrote a formal addendum to her terrain assessment, flagging the emergency alternate route, and submitted it through the S2 section the following Monday. It was logged in the system. Nobody acted on it. She went back to running the route on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In those 4 runs, she kept adding to her own record. She noted what the journal confirmed and what it could not. The thumb was still there, right where her father had named it. The water source at the 8-kilometer mark was still active. But the mountain had also made things since 1987 that no journal could have anticipated. On her second run, after a week of heavy rain, she noticed a drainage channel that appeared at the 34-kilometer mark, a narrow cut in the rock running east-west, tight enough for a single person to move through. She followed it for 40 meters on the south-facing slope before doubling back to the main trail. She noted it in her green notebook the way she noted everything. Not because it seemed useful, but because the mountain had put it there, and she was in the habit of writing down what the mountain showed her. She had run the ridge crossing 4 times by the time the crisis began. The signal's intelligence intercept came in at 2300 on a Thursday night. Bryn was still at her desk when the section chief, a chief warrant officer named Paulson, came through the door moving fast. He said, "We have a problem." She said, "What kind?" He said, "The kind where we need every analyst available right now." She was already pulling up her workstation. The intercept was from an armed group operating in the valley below FOB Kandahar, one of the FARC dissident elements that the advisory mission existed to counter. 32 minutes ago, they had acquired a partial copy of Operational Annex Delta 7. Delta 7 contained the current positional data for every U.S. and Colombian military element operating in the northern Andean sector. Not a complete order of battle, but close enough. 213 personnel, their current positions, their patrol schedules, their resupply routes. The enemy element had acquired this data approximately 32 minutes ago. Based on pattern analysis of their previous operational tempo, they would begin disseminating it to their field teams within 2 to 4 hours. Once disseminated, those field teams would begin moving toward the listed positions within 6 hours. The forward elements at FOB Toro, a smaller installation south of FOB Condor, would be the first in Fur. FOB Toro housed 43 personnel, including a Colombian Army training cadre and their American advisors. The problem was communications. 40 minutes before the intercept, a deliberate jamming package had taken down the communications network covering the sector. Radio, satellite, and cellular, all compromised. The jamming was precise and effective in a way that suggested foreknowledge of the communications architecture. FOB Condor could receive but not transmit. FOB Toro was dark. They could not be warned. The QRF helicopter element was at a lower altitude staging base. The flight time to FOB Toro was approximately 40 minutes, but a weather system had moved in from the west 2 hours ago. Low ceiling, dense fog in the passes. The pilot said they were not flying until it lifted. The forecast said morning, possibly later. There was a road route, 68 kilometers on a mountain road that wound through 3 passes, 4 to 5 hours in a vehicle. But the signal's intelligence also showed enemy elements moving along the road axis. Moving a vehicle along that route meant moving into armed contact in the dark, on a road the enemy also knew. Strand was in the operations room when Bryn arrived. He was running through options with his senior NCO. He looked up when she came in. He did not acknowledge her directly. He said to the room, "We cannot transmit. We cannot fly, and we cannot use the road. We wait for the weather and we fly at first light. That gives us approximately 6 hours before their dissemination reaches field teams. 6 hours until their field teams start moving. We have a window." His senior NCO said, "It's a narrow window, sir." Strand said, "I know, but we do not drive into an ambush and we do not fly into a mountain in the dark." He looked at Paulson. "How long before the jamming degrades?" Paulson said. "Unknown. Could be 2 hours, could be 8. Strand looked at the map again. Bryn looked at the map. She pulled out her green notebook. She opened it to the page she had written on the morning. She found the ridge crossing, the coordinates, the elevation, the estimated transit time. She said, "Captain Strand, there is an alternate route." He looked at her. He did not appear to know her name. She said, "I'm Specialist Hartley, S2 section. I submitted a terrain assessment addendum 3 months ago flagging an emergency alternate route to the Southern Valley." He said, "I don't have that in front of me." She said, "It's in the system log. A ridgeline crossing at 4,100 meters northeast approach. It bypasses the road route entirely. 40 kilometers to the valley floor south of FOB Toro." Strand said 40 kilometers. "In this weather," she said, "the fog is in the lower passes. Above 3,500 meters it's clear. The ridge crossing is at 4,100. He said, "Who made this assessment?" She said, "I did." He looked at her. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing, the one in which a 5'2" courier was proposing to tell him something about mountain terrain that he did not know. He said, "And this route is navigable? At night? In the dark?" She said, "I've run it 4 times. The route was originally mapped by my father. He was in these mountains in 1987 as part of a Corps of Engineers survey team. He estimated 10 to 12 hours for a determined solo traveler." Strand said, "You're proposing to walk 40 kilometers in the dark through the Andes." She said, "Run." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What's on the route?" She said, 3 enemy observation posts that have appeared in the past weeks based on movement analysis." She pulled the analysis printout from her notebook pocket. "Here are their general positions. None of them are on the ridgeline. They're in the valley approaches and the lower trail junctions." Strand looked at the printout. He looked at the map. He looked at her again. He said, "This is a courier route proposal, not an operational plan." She said, "With respect, Captain, it's both. We have 11 hours before field teams begin moving. The ridge route's 10 to 12 hours. If I leave now, I can reach FOB Toro before they're in danger." Strand said, "You're one person." She said, "One person is what fits on a trail that no one else knows exists." He was quiet for a long moment. She had already run through the options. The helicopter wouldn't fly. The road was compromised. Communications were jammed. The window was 11 hours. One person. A trail that existed in a dead man's notebook. Strand said, "What happens if you don't make it?" She said, "The same thing that happens if I don't try." He looked at the printout one more time. He said, "You leave now. You carry a copy of the warning package. You do not engage enemy elements. If you are in contact, you evade and return. Is that understood?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "What do you need?" She said, 30 seconds to get my kit." She was already moving. Her kit for a mountain run was nothing like a soldier's loadout. No body armor, no plate carrier, a lightweight shell jacket against the cold, her personal sidearm, an M17 pistol, a headlamp, 2 liters of water and 2 energy bars. The document package, waterproofed, sealed, carried in the chest pocket of her jacket against her body. Her green notebook left cargo pocket. Her father's journal, right chest pocket. And her trail runners, not military boots. The kind she had been running in since she was 9 years old, with the specific lug pattern her father had taught her to look for in a boot that would need to handle both wet rock and loose scree. She had bought them in Bogota when she arrived in Colombia. The clerk had looked at her feet and said, "These are serious trail shoes. You run mountains?" She had said yes. He had said, "What kind?" She had said Andean. He had not said anything else. He had rung up the shoes. She was at the perimeter wire in 4 minutes. The base was quiet. The fog sat heavy in the lower valley, a white ceiling at roughly 3,000 meters, and above it the stars were clear and sharp in the way they are at altitude when the air is thin and the sky is very close. She clicked the headlamp to its lowest setting. She looked north toward the ridgeline, which she could see against the stars as a dark mass, with a specific shape she had memorized over 4 months of running. She started. The approach to the ridgeline was a 40-minute climb on a trail that technically did not exist in any official record. She had made it herself, over 4 runs, connecting game trails and rocky shelves into a route that was consistent enough to call a trail, if you were generous with the word. The headlamp lit a circle of rock and scrub grass ahead of her. She kept the light low. She moved on the balls of her feet the way her father had taught her when she was 6, and the ground was uncertain. Her father had said, "The foot is smarter than the boot. Let the foot read the ground. The boot just protects." She let her feet read the ground. The first 30 minutes were pure ascent. The trail switchbacked up the face of the ridge in a series of short, steep pitches that required her hands at times, pulling on rock outcroppings to maintain upward momentum. Her breathing settled into a rhythm she knew from hundreds of hours of mountain running. Inhale for 3 steps, exhale for 2. Repeat until the altitude stopped mattering and the rhythm was the only thing that existed. At 3,600 meters, she stopped to check her position against the journal entry. She pulled the journal from her chest pocket and held it close to the headlamp. Her father's handwriting. At this elevation, look for the formation I marked as the thumb. A flat-topped spire of granite approximately 8 meters high on the east face of the ridge. The trail proper begins 50 meters north of the thumb. She looked east. The thumb was there. She had known it would be. She had seen it every time she ran this section. What she had not known, until she read this entry on the ridge 5 months ago, was that her father had named it. In his small, precise script, the thumb. She found the trail proper 50 meters north of it. She increased her pace. The ridge crossing itself was 3 kilometers of exposed terrain above 4,000 meters, where the trail ran along the crest of the ridge with valley on both sides and nothing overhead except stars. The cold here was serious, not the searching cold of the lower elevations, but a clean, direct cold that came from the altitude and the exposed position, and the fact that at this height the atmosphere was approximately 30% thinner than at sea level. She had acclimatized over 8 months of running at altitude. Her body had adapted. But it still required the specific concentration that comes from monitoring your breathing and your footing simultaneously, while the darkness around you is absolute and the ground is uneven rock. She did not find the first enemy position on the ridge. She found it on the descent. The descent on the far side of the ridge was, according to her father's notes, the most technically demanding section of the route. The natural terracing that had made the crossing viable was clear on a map, but required careful navigation on the ground. Because the terraces were not uniform and between them were short, steep drops of 1 to 3 meters that required judgment about whether to descend directly or to traverse and find a lower approach angle. She was 3 kilometers into the descent, at an elevation of approximately 3,400 meters, when she saw the fire. Not a large fire, a small one, a cooking fire or a warming fire, positioned in the shelter of a rock overhang that she could see from above because she was on the terrace directly above it. The glow was faint and orange, and she would not have seen it at all if she had not been watching the terrain with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between seeing and not seeing on a dark mountain was usually a question of attention rather than visibility. She stopped. She turned off the headlamp. She crouched and waited for her eyes to adjust to the natural light, which, at this altitude and with this star coverage, was enough after 30 seconds to see by. 2 shapes near the fire, seated, moving with the occasional small movements of people who are cold and tired and on watch, but not expecting anything from the direction above them. The trail passed directly above and to the right of their position. The natural terrace she was on was 10 meters above them. She studied the terrain. The terrace she was on extended further to the left, away from the fire, and then dropped to a level below the fire's elevation after approximately 40 meters. If she moved left along the terrace, staying flat against the rock, and then descended at the leftmost edge of the terrace, she would come out below and to the west of the fire, outside their field of view. She had 40 meters of open rock between her and the left edge of the terrace. Open, meaning no cover, meaning if either figure looked up, they would see her against the slightly lighter sky. She studied their movement patterns. The one on the left was hunched toward the fire, face down. The one on the right was looking south, down the valley. He was not looking up. He was not expecting anything from above. She moved. She moved the way her father had taught her, to move on uncertain ground in the dark, slowly and deliberately, placing each foot before committing weight, testing rock before trusting it. Keeping her center of gravity low, she kept her face turned away from the fire. 40 meters. She counted them in her head. At 30 meters, the right side figure shifted. He turned his head. She froze. She was flat against the rock, profile minimal, the dark rock behind her absorbing her silhouette. He looked toward her for 2 seconds. She counted them. He turned back to the valley. She finished the 40 meters. She descended the left edge of the terrace on her hands and knees, one limb at a time. She came out below the fire position, below their line of sight. She straightened and walked, quickly and quietly, south along the lower terrace until the fire was 50 meters behind her, and then she was around the curve of the mountain. And below her, the valley was dark, and the stars above were the same stars she had been looking at for hours. She checked the journal. After the terrace descent, the trail enters a secondary valley that runs roughly south for 12 kilometers before opening onto the main valley approach. Water source at the 8-kilometer mark. A spring on the east face. She ran. The secondary valley was narrow and dark, and the trail in it was, as her father had described, clear and narrow, the product of decades of foot traffic by people who had specific reasons to use a route that did not appear on official maps. She ran it at the pace she ran all her routes, steady and sustainable, and somewhat faster than most people would consider comfortable at this altitude. Her feet found the path without the headlamp in the sections where the starlight reached the valley floor. At the 8-kilometer mark, she stopped at the spring. She drank, filled one bottle, ate half an energy bar. She checked the time. She had been running for 3 hours and 20 minutes. She was on pace. She pulled the journal and checked the next section. Her father's handwriting, secondary valley ends at a junction. Right branch continues the mountain route for 28 additional kilometers. The right branch has 2 known observation points from the 1987 survey, unknown current status. She made a note in her green notebook. She had identified 3 current enemy positions from her movement analysis. One she had just passed. The second was at approximately the halfway point of the right branch. The third was near the southern exit of the route, at the section her father had marked with a specific notation she would not fully understand until she got there. She took the right branch. The second position was harder to predict than the first. The first position had been static, fire and 2 figures, readable from above. The second position was, according to her movement analysis, a mobile element operating in a 2-kilometer stretch of trail between the 18 and 20-kilometer marks. Mobile meant unpredictable. She could not plan around it. She could only enter that section slowly and carefully and respond to what she found. She entered the section at its northern end at approximately 0200. The terrain here was different from the upper ridgeline. More vegetated, dwarf trees and thick scrub, the kind of growth that exists at this altitude where the conditions are harsh but not impossible. The trail ran through it, and the vegetation on either side was dense enough to provide concealment both ways. She slowed to a walk. She moved through the scrub trail with her headlamp off and her hand extended ahead of her to feel for branches. She was listening. The specific kind of listening her father had described on dozens of trail runs in the White Mountains. He had said, "Listen for what doesn't belong." Not unusual sounds, sounds that are usual in the wrong context. At the 19-kilometer mark, she heard breathing. Not an animal, too regular, too slow, a person asleep or very nearly. She stopped. She tracked the sound. Right side of the trail, approximately 4 meters into the scrub vegetation. She held very still and waited. After 90 seconds, she heard a second sound, the creak of equipment, nylon on metal, the sound of someone adjusting their position. Awake then, or nearly. She continued on the trail. She moved at a pace that was not quite walking and not quite creeping, somewhere between them, placing each foot with deliberateness. She kept her breathing shallow and even. Her right hand on the trail surface ahead of her, feeling for anything that would make sound under her feet. She passed the position. She went 4 meters past it, and then 6, and then 10. And the breathing continued unchanged behind her, and she walked for 30 more meters before she allowed herself to increase her pace, and 50 more before she allowed herself to breathe normally. She had used up 22 minutes. She ran the next 8 kilometers. The terrain in this section was the kind that requires 2 things simultaneously: speed and judgment. Speed because she needed to make up the time she had lost. Judgment because the trail here crossed 2 small streams, descended through a loose rock section, and had one section of narrow ledge trail, where the drop to the right was significant enough in the dark to require care. She handled all of these with the competence of someone who has handled them before, which she had, on the runs that nobody knew about, on the Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the base woke up. At 27 kilometers, she began to feel the altitude. This was not unexpected. 8 months of acclimatization had improved her body's efficiency significantly. But 40 kilometers in the dark after a full day of work was beyond what she usually asked of her body. And the section she was entering now climbed back up to 3,600 meters before descending again. The combination of fatigue and altitude and cold began to do what it does to a human body that has been running for 6 hours, not breaking it, but making it honest about what it had left. Her legs were fine. 8 months of mountain running had built what she needed. Her lungs were the problem. The cumulative effect was showing in the slightly less precise footwork, the fraction of a second's slower reaction to uncertain ground. She stopped at a red-banded granite formation, her father's notes identified as a specific landmark at approximately the 28-kilometer mark. She sat on it. She drank the rest of her water. She ate the second half of the energy bar. She breathed slowly and completely, filling her lungs as fully as altitude would allow. Her father had said, "At altitude you breathe with your whole body, not just your lungs, your whole body. Think of the air going into your legs, your arms. Think of it going into your hands." He had paused. "It's not real, but thinking it makes you breathe deeper. And breathing deeper at altitude is real." She breathed with her whole body. She thought about his voice, not the specific words, the quality of it, the patience in it. He had never rushed her on a trail. He had run at her pace without complaint, even when she was small and her stride was short, and he could have covered the same ground in half the time. He had said once, "A trail is only finished when you finish it. Until then, it's just the trail in front of you." She thought about the section ahead. Her father's note for the third enemy position contained a notation she had read 4 times on her previous runs and had not yet needed to act on. His note, "Observation Post Aleph, Western Ledge at 3,050 meters, approximately 3 meters wide. Access by moving left off trail 15 meters before the large cairn rock. Excellent concealment from below." She had planned to use that ledge. She had planned to move left at the cairn, get onto the ledge, and pass the observation post from a position below their line of sight. She had been planning this for 200 kilometers of Tuesday and Thursday runs. After 4 minutes, she stood up and ran. The descent from the 28-kilometer mark was the kind that destroyed the legs of runners who were not prepared for it. The long continuous downhill that loaded the quadriceps and the knees and the tendons in ways that uphill running does not. She was prepared for it. She let the slope carry her forward and used her arms for balance and let her feet do the work. The creek crossing at 30 kilometers was knee-deep and moving fast from recent rain. She waded it in 20 seconds, soaking her shoes through, and kept running. Cold feet she knew how to manage. You keep moving, the body adjusts. That was how it always worked. At 32 kilometers, her left ankle turned slightly on a loose rock. She felt it roll, corrected, did not fall, kept running. She cataloged it. Ankle manageable, 8 kilometers remaining, body tired but functional. She was running on the accountant's version of herself, the part that kept books on what was spent and what remained, and made clear-eyed decisions about how to distribute what was left. At 33.5 kilometers, she began watching for the large cairn rock. She found it at 34 kilometers. Unmistakable, a flat-topped stack of stones approximately waist height, set deliberately at the trail edge, the kind of marker made by someone who wanted to be able to find the same spot again. Her father's marker, placed in 1987. She moved left off the trail. She moved 15 meters on a compass bearing northwest, picking her way through loose rock and scrub in the dark, keeping her headlamp low, looking for the ledge. She found the scar instead. It was unmistakable. A long, wide fan of broken rock that spread out from a fresh cliff face above, the kind of scar left by a landslide that has settled and weathered over many years. Not last week, not last year, decades old. The rock was pale gray, almost white in the headlamp, showing the clean face of interior stone that had not been exposed to weather for long enough to darken. The fan spread out across the area where the western ledge had been. There was no ledge. There was rubble, steep and unstable, 5 meters deep at the cliff base spreading out below. She stood on the edge of the scree slope and looked at it. She pulled the journal from her chest pocket. She held it open to the entry. Western ledge at 3,050 meters, approximately 3 meters wide. Excellent concealment from below. Her father had mapped a ledge that no longer existed. Somewhere between 1987 and now, the cliff face above had given way. A single night of rain and freeze and the long, slow work of decades had taken the ledge and buried it under everything above it. The mountain had changed after her father left. Before she arrived, she closed the journal. She was at 34 kilometers, 800 meters down the trail, from the observation post that was somewhere above and ahead of her, on a route that her father's map could no longer fully describe. The enemy was there. She could not use the ledge. She could not pass below the post. She could not go back. The notebook is a starting point, not the destination. The mountain will tell you what it is when you get there. She stood at Auberk on the scree slope and thought about what the mountain was telling her. She thought about the 4 runs she had made over this section. She thought about what she had seen on those runs that was not in the journal, because it was something that had not been there in 1987. Something that had come into existence in the years since. Something the mountain had made in its own time. The drainage channel. She had found it on her second run after a week of heavy rain, a narrow cut in the rock running east-west just below this slope. She had followed it for 40 meters along the south-facing side of the ridge before doubling back. The channel ran under and past the observation post position, coming out on the south-facing slope below the post, opening toward the valley. It was the mountain's answer to the ledge the mountain had taken. She had written it in her green notebook because she noted everything. She had not known then that she would need it. She opened the green notebook. She found the entry, drainage channel, east entrance 12 meters south of the cairn, approximately 40 meters, exits on south-facing slope the below post position, continues toward valley. She went back to the cairn. She moved 12 meters south of it. She found the entrance to the channel, barely visible in the headlamp, just a shadow in the rock face that was deeper than it should be. She turned the headlamp off. She moved into the channel by feel. The channel was narrow. Her shoulders were within inches of the rock on both sides. The floor was uneven. She moved with both hands extended, fingers trailing the rock walls, her feet reading the ground below one step at a time. She could not see anything. She was moving by touch and by the knowledge that the channel went 40 meters and came out on the south-facing slope below the post, pointing her toward the valley, pointing her toward FOB Toro. It took 9 minutes. The channel was not in her father's journal. It was in her green notebook. It was not the mountain her father had mapped. It was the mountain as it was now, as she had found it on her own, on the morning runs that nobody had watched her run. She came out the far end of the channel into open air. She stopped. She listened. Above her, somewhere up the slope, she heard the specific sound of a person shifting position. Boots on rock, the creak of equipment. The observation post was still occupied. She was below and south of it, on the far side, below their line of sight, the post between her and the ridge behind her, the valley open ahead. She moved south. She moved quietly and steadily south, keeping the rock face above her on the left, putting distance between herself and the post, letting the terrain and the dark work the way she had always known. They worked for a person who understood them. After 200 meters, she increased her pace. After 400 meters, she ran. The last 6 kilometers were not dramatic. They were simply hard. The kind of hard that exists in the final section of any long run, when the body has used most of what it started with, and the legs are running on something that is not quite muscle and not quite will, and is perhaps both together in a combination that has no better name than stubbornness. She ran on stubbornness and on the knowledge that FOB Toro was at the end of the trail. She ran on a trail that existed in 2 notebooks now. Her father's, which had brought her close. Her own, which had told her what to do when his could no longer help. The lights of FOB Toro appeared at 0947. Below her and to the south, a small cluster of red and white lights in the valley floor. She was running on the last descent when she saw them. She did not slow down. She ran straight toward them. The perimeter guard stopped her at the wire. She said her name, her unit, her clearance level. She said the emergency document transfer. She said she needed the commanding officer immediately. She had been running for 10 hours and 47 minutes. The commanding officer of FOB Toro was a major named Carrasco. He came to the gate looking like a man who had been woken up, because he had been. He looked at the small, wet, muddy person standing at his perimeter wire and said, "Who are you?" She said, "Specialist Hartley. S2, FOB Condor. I have an emergency warning package." She opened her jacket and removed the document package from her chest pocket. "Major, you need to read this right now." She had been at FOB Toro for 40 minutes when the jamming stopped and comms came back up and Strand's voice came over the radio from FOB Condor, confirming the warning. By then, Carrasco had already begun moving his personnel. Bryn was sitting on a supply crate in the operations room, drinking the coffee someone had put in her hand, feeling the specific total exhaustion that exists after a body has done the thing it was capable of doing and stopped. Not injury, not damage, just the complete, honest emptiness of a body that has given what it had. She still had the journal in her chest pocket and the green notebook in her left cargo pocket, both of them together. She put her hand over the chest pocket and felt the familiar weight and shape of the journal. She thought about the drainage channel, the 9 minutes of moving through rock in the dark by touch alone. She thought about standing on the scree slope with the journal open and the ledge gone and the mountain telling her, in the only language mountains use, that the world had moved on from what had been written down. She had listened. She had answered. She thought, "I made it, Dad, and I found something you didn't map." She sat with that thought for a while, in the quiet of the operations room, while outside the Colombian dawn worked itself up over the valley. Then she finished the coffee and waited for the helicopter. The formal review of the operation happened at brigade level 2 weeks later. Bryn was asked to submit her terrain documentation as part of the after-action record. The green notebook, the 4 months of route observations, the emergency alternate route assessment she had submitted and that had been logged and not acted on, the notation about the drainage channel, the landslide that had changed the terrain since 1987. She submitted all of it, exactly as she had kept it, factual and sequential and complete. The brigade S2 officer read her terrain addendum from 3 months earlier, the one that had been logged in the system without action. He read the coordinates, the elevation notes, the emergency route designation. He said to his staff, "This was in our system and nobody acted on it?" His staff confirmed it had been logged. He said, "This trail saved 43 personnel and potentially another 170 at the adjacent positions." He stopped. "Why didn't we act on this 3 months ago?" Nobody had a satisfactory answer. The nearest thing to an answer was that it had been submitted by a courier attached to the S2 section, and the operational routing process had treated it as a terrain observation rather than an emergency route assessment, because the person who submitted it was not categorized as an operational source, because she was standard issue for what she did. The brigade commander directed a formal reassessment of terrain data submission protocols, requiring that all S2 analyst terrain observations be reviewed by the operational planning cell, regardless of the source's assigned function. He cited the Andean alternate route case specifically. He cited Specialist Hartley by name. Captain Strand signed a formal commendation recommendation for Bryn. He did it correctly and accurately, citing the document delivery, the terrain knowledge, the 11-hour transit. The commendation was professional and factual. It did not include the words "I was wrong" or "I should have listened to you" or "standard issue" meant nothing about what you were capable of. He was not the kind of man who said those things. But he signed the recommendation without reducing it, which was not nothing. Bryn read it once. She put it in her file. She was promoted to sergeant within the year. She did not think about the commendation much after that. Commendations were paper. The trail was the trail, and the mountain was still out there, still changing in ways that no paper could fully capture. She had understood this now, in a way she had not before. The landslide had taught her. Her father's careful map, which had brought her 40 kilometers across the Andes, had failed her at the one moment she most needed it. And what had saved her was not what he had written down in 1987, but what she had seen herself, noted in her own notebook for no reason except habit. And because her father had taught her that the mountain would tell you what it is when you get there. Listening was the job. She had been a good listener. She was becoming a better one. 3 days after she returned from FOB Toro, she was at her desk in the S2 section, running analysis on movement patterns in the sector when Strand came in. He did not say anything at first. He put a rolled operational map on her desk. He unrolled one corner with the northeastern sector visible, the ridge crossing, the trail she had run, the section where the ledge no longer existed and where a drainage channel had appeared in its place. He put a marking pen beside the map. He said the terrain database needs updating. Not just the route, the details, the things that have changed since the original survey. The drainage, the landslide, all of it. She looked at the map. She looked at the pen. He said, "You know things about this terrain that aren't in any record." She sees nothing. He turned to leave. At the door he paused. He said, "Specialist Hartley, not courier, specialist." He looked at her directly, not through her, at her. Then he left. She sat for a moment. She picked up her green notebook, opened it to the first page of Columbia entries, and read what she had written over 8 months of Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the mountains before the base woke up. The drainage channel at COM 34. East entrance 12 meters south of the cairn, 40 meters. Exits on south-facing slope toward valley. She drew it on the map, careful and precise, the way her father had drawn things. The landslide scar, western face, 3,050 meters. Ledge no longer viable, scree slope impassable. She marked it, added a date estimate. The water source at kilometer 8, confirmed still active 30 years after the original survey. She marked it with a small circle. The thumb, her father had named it. She added the name to the map in small letters, the way he had written in the journal. She worked for a long time. The operations room was quiet around her. Through the window, the ridgeline was visible to the north, dark against the morning sky. The thumb there, if you knew where to look. At some point, she picked up her father's journal and held it in her left hand while she marked the map with her right. She was not copying from it. She already knew what it said. She held it the way she had always held it, because the weight of it was familiar and the weight of it was right. But she was not adding his knowledge to the map. She was adding her own. When she was done, she rolled the map and took it to the S3 planning cell and marked it for operational distribution. Then she came back, opened a fresh page in her green notebook, and wrote at the top, Hartley Route NE7, updated. She put the notebook in her left cargo pocket. She put the journal in her right chest pocket. She went back to work.